So we had a politician very much interested in science. Now I propose to do the other way around. We'll hear about a scientist who is very much interested in politics. Naomi Oreskes, can you hear me well? Okay, we can't hear you on the other hand. Just hold a second. Can you speak again?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, we can hear you perfectly. Great.
Good morning.
Good afternoon from here.
Sorry, good afternoon.
No worries. Good morning to you. Mrs. Oreskes, you are currently Professor of the History of Science and Affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. You were trained as a geologist and science historian. You are the co-author with Ori Conway of Merchants of Doubt, a book published in 2010, and an excellent documentary of the same name made this year, describing the similar tactics and individuals in the attacks you received after you published an article on the scientific consensus on the human origin of climate change in the literature. So a parallel between the tactics and the individuals there and earlier attacks on scientists on other issues, such as acid rains, the role of chlorofluorocarbons in the hole in the ozone layer, and above all, tobacco smoking. These past years, you have combined your academic activities with relentless activism on climate change, publishing a book of science-based fiction, optimistically called The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future, whose description of a catastrophic future caused by Western countries' inaction on the causes of man-made climate change is aimed, obviously, at provoking its readers into action. And very recently, you have written the foreword to the English edition to the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si on climate change. I have really many questions to ask you, but I'm afraid you will probably not have the time to answer them all. So I propose that among all those I'm going to ask you, you just pick the ones you like or the ones you want to answer. And yeah, I'm going to start. So the first question, where does, in your opinion, the doubt-mongering strategy over unwanted scientific evidence come from? And to what extent does it enable industry to delay regulation? My second question is, what are the consequences of these tactics for society, but also for science itself? Third question, are industry actors the only ones to use these tactics, or do other lobbyists, such as NGOs, use them too? Are the consequences comparable? How to mitigate such tactics? Can research funding, transparency, and interest disclosure help? Is policy-driven or market-driven research necessarily inferior to curiosity-driven research? The perversity of these tactics is that systematic doubt is in many ways the cornerstone of the scientific methodology itself. How to make the difference between reasonable and spurious doubt. An important finding of your book is the ideological connection between most of the scientists who accept to play the doubt-mongering game and actually before financial incentives come in. Indeed, these persons were often the same on the different issues, but shared a common ideological aversion for governmental interference in society. However, do you think that these persons would have had the same impact without the financial support of economic actors? A related question. The scientific consensus on the man-made nature of contemporary climate change is very high, but one sees clearly that political action is lacking, not to say irrelevant, for now. The World Health Organization's Framework Convention for Tobacco Control stipulates that the interaction between tobacco lobbyists and policymakers should be restricted to the strict minimum and regulated by systematic disclosure measures. Do you think that it makes sense to draw the parallel and that such lobbying regulations should apply to the economic sectors to stand to lose from tough regulation on CO2 emissions? And my last question, do you have any ideas about how science and democracy could reinforce each other? Thank you. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Hello, bonjour. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be with you there in person, but glad that you were able to accommodate me electronically. Are you able to hear me? Excellent, thank you. So Martin was kind enough to send me these questions ahead of time. So I've slightly regrouped them, but I will try to answer most of them in the time allowed. So as some of you know, some of you are familiar with my work with Eric Conway. We've spent really the last decade studying this question of the use of doubt as a political strategy to prevent action on various important issues, of which climate change is the one I am most engaged with. But the whole point of our book, Merchants of Doubt, was to show how these strategies were used very, very broadly on many diverse issues that many people might otherwise think of as being different, and that scientists themselves had thought of as being different and unrelated. So most climate scientists had no idea that they were being targeted in the same way that scientists who had worked on tobacco had been targeted. So what is the essence of the strategy? The essence of the strategy is to create doubt, and to use doubt to create confusion, and to use confusion to delay regulatory and social and political action. The key strategy was developed initially by the tobacco industry, and it's a very simple strategy that's easy to summarize. Scientists begin to find compelling evidence that there's a problem with a product. It might be tobacco, it might be the chemicals that deplete the ozone layer, it might be fossil fuels. The scientific evidence begins to become strong. The corporate sector realizes they have a problem. So what do? They challenge the science. They try to create doubt. They say that the science is highly uncertain. They hire or they find experts who have dissenting opinions to try to create the impression of a robust scientific debate, and therefore argue that because the science is unsettled, therefore it would be premature to act. And in our book and in the film, we document how this strategy has been used repeatedly over half a century to delay action on many important issues that protect the public health and safety. Now, why does this work? Well, there are many reasons that it works, but one that I've been interested in as a person who comes at this issue from the disciplines of history and philosophy of science is that it draws on the strength of science and tries to turn that into a weakness. So all of us close to science know that in any scientific study, in any research, in any scientific area, there is always uncertainty. Science is never absolute. The dream of creating absolute knowledge is one that most scientists have abandoned a long time ago. The positivist dream of absolutely certain science is one that almost no philosopher or scientist would defend today. We all acknowledge that science is uncertain and that any live science always has unanswered questions, but that doesn't mean that everything is just a big epistemological mess. The fact that we don't know everything doesn't mean that we don't know anything. But what the doubt-mongering strategy tries to do is to imply just that, to say that because there are some unanswered questions, therefore everything is unanswered and we cannot act because we don't have sufficient basis to act. This is a very clever strategy because it takes the strength of science and turns it into a weakness. And it's clever because scientists have a very hard time arguing against it, because if I'm a tobacco industry executive and I say, well, there are many questions remaining about the mechanisms by which smoking might be implicated in cancer, a scientist can't say, no, that's not true. A scientist can't say that's a lie, because it's not a lie. It's a kind of half-truth. It's partly true. And it's the half-truth aspect of it that makes it powerful. So it's very hard to combat. It's also hard for scientists to combat because in general, scientists like to stay in their lab and do research. Most scientists don't want to be activists. They don't want to be out in public. So to combat it, we're asking scientists to do something that they're not trained to do, that they don't really know how to do very well. And when they try to do it, they often don't do it very well. Now, one of Martin's questions has to do with the role of ideology and money. So one of the questions we posed in our research was, why were these strategies so effective? Why did they gain so much traction in the United States in particular? And what we were able to show was that they really tapped into a kind of strong ideological argument. We also showed that part of the way, well, let me back up. Part of the way this strategy works is to recruit scientists. Because if an industry executive says GMOs are safe or tobacco is safe or fossil fuels are fine, many people would be skeptical of those claims, knowing that they're coming from an industry with a clear vested financial self-interest. So the industry understood that. And so the strategy involves recruiting scientists or other people who might be perceived to be credible to make the case for them. In one tobacco industry example, they had a project they called Project White Coat, that they would recruit scientists who would appear in white coats so that they would give credibility to these arguments. So one of the questions we had is, well, why would any scientist participate in that? And what we were able to show in the research was that although it wasn't, money obviously played a role, it wasn't primarily about money, that it was primarily about ideology, that the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industries all tapped into this ideological defense of free market capitalism, and the argument that if we compromise free market capitalism by having too many regulations, that we will compromise our political and social freedoms as well. And in the book, we really explore how this argument resonates, particularly in the United States, because of a particular set of historical and cultural beliefs that have been very strong in the United States. So the ideology is part of what makes it resonant. It's part of what makes ordinary people accept arguments that they otherwise might not even be paying attention to. So that plays out differently in Europe, where arguments about unregulated capitalism are different than they are in the United States. The story's not the same in Europe as it is in the United States. But the use of ideology, the principle that you can invoke ideological principles to defend and to camouflage corporate self-interest, of course, is something that can be done anywhere. So with GMOs, we see the corporate sector claiming that they're philanthropists and humanitarians who want to feed the world. And that, of course, appeals to people who are concerned about hunger and poverty around the globe. So what about money? Well, of course, money is part of the story, too. In our research, we focused on the ideological questions because we thought those were more complicated and, frankly, more interesting. We thought it was sort of obvious that money was a huge driver of all of this. We didn't really think that argument needed to be made. But one risk of focusing on anything in your work is that if you focus on A and you neglect B, people will criticize you for neglecting B or think you're saying that B is not important. So just to be clear, we think that the reason this works is because of a combination of money and ideology. The ideology gives it resonance, but the money makes it possible to spread this message through advertising, through think tanks, by donations to researchers, by donations to political organizations. So the money is the fuel that's driving it, and the ideology is sort of, well, to use the fire analogy, it's like the ideology is the wind that spreads it, I guess. Okay, so why does all of this matter? Well, clearly our argument is that this has a tremendous adverse impact. The adverse society is clear. The impacts include the fact that the public becomes confused. So we'd like to have a robust discussion. In any democratic society, we should be having robust discussions of these issues, but it's difficult to do that when people are confused about the evidence, confused about what the scientific data actually say. That confusion leads to inactivity, which is exactly the point. The whole point of the strategy is to delay regulatory action, to delay laws or rules or regulations or taxation structures that could be put into place to address the problem and protect the public interest. And we've seen how this works effectively. Climate change is the most obvious example. It's 23 years since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. We're heading into Paris now for COP21. That means it's the 21st meeting of the Committee of Parties to the Framework Convention. And the world has made essentially no progress in controlling the greenhouse gases and deforestation that drive disruptive climate change. So I think we have to say that these strategies have been very effective in delaying action on climate change, and we can make the same argument on tobacco control and many other issues. I think there's also an adverse impact on science. I think one of the things that we have seen in the scientific community is that when the scientific community are faced with repeated attacks and repeated misrepresentations of their work, at least some members of the scientific community get defensive. It's hard not to be defensive when you're being unfairly attacked. And in some cases, it leads to scientists closing ranks. And I think that those of you who have followed the IPCC closely can see ways in which this has happened in the IPCC in ways that are, I would say, not helpful for robust and transparent public debate about the important issues. I also think it makes it hard to have legitimate debate about questions that we need to be talking about. So if we take the example of GMOs, and I have not personally worked on GMOs, but obviously I followed the work of others who have, it seems to me that the GMO issue is complicated in part because there are a set of elements, some of which are scientific and technical, some of which have to do with political economy, some of which have to do with the quality and the taste of our food, some of it have to do with environmental safety and the impact of GMOs on other crops and other species and biodiversity. Because of the attacks on science, one of the things we've seen in the United States is that scientists have kind of got into a defensive mode defending GMOs. And if anybody tries to raise questions about some of these other more complex and political and social elements, some scientists take that as an attack on the science. And it's become very hard in the United States to disentangle the technical questions about, let's say, whether or not GMOs are safe to eat from some of the political, social, and biodiversity issues that are also important in this debate. Martin asked the question, do NGOs also do this? It's become very popular in the United States to try to claim that these kinds of doubt-mongering strategies are used by both sides, that NGOs and democratic groups also do this. I found very little evidence to support that claim. I think that claim is just another example of the doubt-mongering strategy. Now that it's been exposed, what's happened, now the corporate actors say, oh, well, everyone does it. The other side does it too. We could talk more about the evidence related to that. But in my own work, I see very little evidence to support that argument. And if we have time later, I could say more about why that is. So what is the solution to this? Martin asked, is the solution that all science should be curiosity-driven? And I think the answer to that is clearly no. Clearly, there's an important need in many different ways for what we could call policy-driven or mission-driven science. And certainly the corporate sector has the right to fund science. And if we look at the history of science and technology, we can find many examples of what we could call productive and useful science that was funded by the private sector. So this is not an argument against private sector funding of science or against public sector funding of policy-driven science. But what it is and I also want to be clear, some people I think have misread our work to think that Eric Conway and I are arguing for some kind of idealized positivist vision of pure science. And that would be a great misinterpretation of our conclusions. Eric and I are not naive. We don't think, I don't even think that pure science exists in its idealized form. I think that is just an idealization. But this is an argument for at least two things. It's an argument for the importance of the independence of published research. One of the things that we know about corporate-funded science is that it often comes with strings attached, and one of those strings has to do with the confidentiality of research results. We know that in the United States, there has been a large amount of research done on questions like pesticide safety that has never been published because of confidentiality agreements. And we know, and we have strong evidence to support this, that if, let's say, a chemical company funds research on a chemical, and that research shows that the chemical is safe, the company is very eager to see those results published and supports publication. But if the evidence shows that the chemical may not be safe, in many cases, the corporations suppress the publication of that data. So what we get now is a bias or skewing of the scientific literature in favor of results that show that drugs or chemicals or GMOs are safe, and a suppression of evidence that might be to the contrary. I think that should be illegal. I think we need rules and regulations that make it illegal to suppress scientific data in the public interest. How that should be done is a complicated question, but I think it's crucially important. And we have lots and lots of evidence that this is going on. I also think this is an argument for transparency. I know there are many people here today who have written on the question of transparency. I think it's absolutely crucial that the public know who is funding scientific research. Again, we have a lot of evidence regarding what has sometimes been referred to as the funding effect. We know that it does matter who pays for the science, that the man who pays the piper doesn't always call the tune, but often he does. So it's very important. I think, again, there should be rules and regulations that say that any publication of scientific data must say who the funders of that scientific research are. Many journals are beginning to have policies to require that, but many still do not. Most universities do not. So it's a big issue. And then the third issue has to do with the question of public funding for science that Monsieur Beauvais mentioned just a few moments ago. One of the reasons that this problem has become worse in the last decade or so, in my view, is because of the reduction in support for publicly funded research. I don't think that research has to be publicly funded to be reliable and robust, but I do think that it's a problem when we see decreasing amounts of funding for independent publicly funded research and increasing amounts of funding that rely on the private sector. It's caused universities to become more and more dependent on the private sector and therefore more reluctant, I think, to speak out when there is evidence that there are problems. And again, I think we are increasingly seeing this. Again, I study mostly the United States, but certainly in America, we've seen many universities where issues have come up about conflict of interest in research, where universities have been reluctant to take strong positions against conflict of interest because of fear of losing their corporate sponsors. So I think that's enough talking for the moment, and I do want to make sure to leave time for questions. I hope that's been useful and informative. Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Thank you. My name is Lisette Van Vliet, and I'm from the Health and Environment Alliance. We work on environmental health issues, and I work on toxic chemical issues. I want to go back to what you said about how the manufacture of doubt and these strategies are harmful to science. You said that it was harmful to the public debate and the understanding of what the science is. And I want to dig a bit deeper to see if you think it's also harmful to the way scientists amongst each other are formulating what needs investigating and how they understand what they are finding. Because it's one thing to harm the public debate and then the democratic consequences of what do we do with the evidence we have, but it's another thing about whether it's actually harming the evolution of scientific inquiry itself. And I wanted to see if you could talk to that. Thank you.
Sure, that's a great question. Of course, it's difficult to answer a question like that because there is no such thing as pure science, and science always lives and breathes and exists in a social context in which scientists are responding to social concerns. And that, I would argue, in a way, is a good thing. We want science to be responsive. I don't think we would want a science that was hermetically sealed in a laboratory. I don't think that would be a good thing. But I can give you a couple of examples from the area I know best, which is climate change. So I think two things have happened in the climate science community that I think are pretty clear, and I think are, we could say, harmful to science or not ideal. So one thing just has to do with the nature of the research that's been done in the last 20 years or so. So we know from scientific work that was done in the late 80s or early 90s that scientists had come to a broad consensus that man-made climate change was underway, and they had come to that consensus by the early 1990s. For the next 20 years, the IPCC kept repeating that claim and wrote reports that were longer and longer and had more and more detail. But if you look at the basic scientific conclusions, they have not changed in 20 years. The basic evidence on the climate sensitivity and other key questions about climate change in relation to the issues that matter for public concern, the evidence has not substantially changed. A lot of details have been filled in, but the basic framework is the same. And I think you can argue, as a historian, I would argue, that scientists have spent a lot of time and energy and money working on a lot of details that haven't actually made a difference. So I think that the scientific agenda has become a little bit stuck, in part because they've been in this defensive and responsive mode, because people have just kept hammering at them and challenging them. So I think in a way what we could say has been a sort of waste of scientific capital, scientific man and woman power, a waste of scientific time. The other thing that's happened, I think this one is worse, and I can say this now with confidence because my article on this with Steve Lewandowski and James Rizzi has just been published, and this is something we've been trying to get published for over a year. Had a terrible time publishing it because it was critical of the scientific community, and scientific community is not very keen on publishing articles in peer-reviewed journals that point out bad things that they've done. But many of you have heard the claim that global warming paused or stopped, or that there was a hiatus over the last 10 or 15 years. That claim is completely bogus. It was a claim that was invented by contrarian think tanks. They started promoting it around 2000. Those of us who were tracking the contrarian movement were very aware of it. And for quite a few years, scientists ignored it. And then somehow scientists began to think that they had to respond to that claim. Now, it could have been possible to respond to the claim by saying, this is a bogus contrarian claim, it's false, and here's why. But that's not what happened. What happened was that scientists actually internalized the claim and started publishing articles that accepted it, that said that there was a pause and tried to explain why it was happening, tried to offer mechanisms to explain. Steve Lewandowski, James Rizzi, and I went back and we looked again at the statistical evidence, and we were able to demonstrate, and there's actually 2 papers that have just been published this week. There's ours, and there's another one in climatic change by a group from Stanford. Different studies, we did use slightly different methodologies, but the same basic point. There is no statistically significant pause or warming of the last 15 years. The fluctuation, the rate of warming is no different than other fluctuations that have occurred in the past. So the whole claim is entirely bogus, and yet we counted more than 40 papers in peer-reviewed literature that accepted this claim, and we're trying to explain it. So that's not just a huge waste of scientific resources, capital, manpower, woman power, but it also led to an incredibly misleading public debate in which many, many people around the globe now think that warming stopped over the last 15 years, and that's simply not true.
Thank you. I see other questions. Mr. Ashford.
Yeah. Nicholas Ashford from MIT. Thank you very much for your good work, Naomi. It's impressive and very important. Let me raise a couple of issues. First, and maybe you say this in your book, but the availability of academic scientists to undertake independent work has greatly diminished. It's greatly diminished for a number of reasons. First of all, our science funding agency in the United States, like the National Science Foundation, gives 15 times less support for sustainable development issues than the Europeans do. So the basis of funding has greatly dried up. Secondly, from the point of view of the legal strategy, there's lurking behind all of this issue is the possibility of lawsuits and damages for things that are done. And what the chemical and climate change industry does is it gives small grants and contracts to tie up the academics so that they are not available to testify on the other side. So there's the great progress in the 70s on environmental issues was because there were a sufficient number of environmental and occupational scientists who really did independent work, did find that vinyl chloride, asbestos, and so forth were a problem. These people hardly exist anymore. Now, you add to this the fact that, well, I know tomorrow we're going to be talking about science advice, but Mr. Clinton and Mr. Gore actually were the ones who signed off on the destruction of the U.S. Congress Office of Technology Assessment. That was not in the executive branch. That was in the congressional branch. It was bipartisan. And that organization did a lot to draw the question about the efficacy of Star Wars, of GMOs, the problems with office automation. This doesn't exist anymore. So you don't have public interest scientists either funded or finding a voice. And then you finally add one more ingredient, which is the press that controls the giving of equal space to unequally meritorious ideas is responsible for the confusion about the fact people don't know whether global climate change exists. And then just a word about some tomorrow's comments. and that is, with all due respect, I think we have tied ourselves into a loop by arguing that the questions are about science. The questions are also about technology. I mean, if you don't know whether something is harmful or not, and you made no mention of the precautionary principle, which I think is extraordinarily important here, but beyond the precautionary principle, the point is, if you can find a clearly better way to satisfy human needs in food, in energy, whatever, and they're clearly safer, even if the alternatives are doubtfully harmful, you need to understand and disseminate the information that there are cures to this doubt problem that are not settled on scientific grounds. I think that we have closed ourselves and put the wagons around the wrong pole.
Thank you. So you broke up a little bit. I didn't hear everything, so I'll do the best I can to respond. And if I slightly misinterpreted something, I apologize. And thank you for the kind words at the start of your comment. So absolutely, I think I agree with everything you said. Certainly, journalists have been a big part of this issue. And in the book, we have a whole section where we talk about the role of the media in giving equal time to unequally supported views. And if you're interested in that, Max Boykoff at Colorado State University has also written extensively on that. On the question of the role of scientists, I think this is hugely important. And I would really like to see a much bigger discussion in the scientific community about this. I think many scientists have been afraid to speak up about what they know for fear of being labeled activists. And in this sense, I think the scientific community has contributed substantially to this problem. And again, particularly in the United States, I think it's a bit different in Europe. But the scientific community itself is very critical of scientists who speak up in public on some of these issues. I think this has changed somewhat in the last couple of years, particularly in climate science, where climate scientists are now sort of recognizing the need for them to be heard clearly in the public conversation. But I think the academic community has to be much more supportive of the idea that it's very, very important for at least some of its members to be speaking clearly in public about these issues and about what science can and can't solve. So what aspects of these problems are scientific and technical and can be answered by scientific information, and what questions are essentially political or economic or social and need the participation of society more broadly and social scientists. So I think that's terribly important. I also think that academic leaders have not really stepped up to the plate on this. I know you mentioned NSF, and I think you said there was not as much funding for sustainability research in the United States as there is in Europe. So that's a failure of scientific leadership. That's a failure of our program directors at NSF. It's a failure of our university deans and presidents who are in communication with the National Science Foundation. So I think we need to be speaking up more on our own campuses to our own deans and our own university leaders to say, we need to be out in front. We need to be talking to the National Science Foundation, because it is true that NSF is not wholly independent. It responds to Congress, but it's true that a lot of the agenda within the National Science Foundation is set by scientists who are part of the problem because of their own reticence or nervousness or reluctance to take on issues that could be accused of being political. So I think that's very important. You've said this is not just an issue of science, it's also an issue of technology. Absolutely, I agree completely. Sometimes I use the word science as a shorthand for science and technology, which I shouldn't do, so I apologize for that. But on the subject of technology, if you've not yet had a chance to read the Papal encyclical, I hope you will. It's an amazing document. It's a document that I think anyone in science studies will be stunned at the sophistication of his thinking about questions that we talk about. He doesn't cite Langdon Winter, but it all certainly sounds as if he's read him or talked to people who have. He has a very sophisticated discussion of what he calls the technocratic paradigm and the whole question of what our relationship to technology is and how we think about technology as a social, political, and economic problem. So I strongly urge everyone to read it. It's a beautifully written document. It's very provocative. It's very radical, and it should be a talking point for all of us. Last point, I think, was on the Office of Technology Assessment. Many people have said that the closing of the OTA in America was a big, big mistake, a big problem. But if we feel that way, the reality is there's no way that the present US Congress is going to bring back the Office of Technology Assessment. So given that, I'd like to see the scientific community mobilize, reach out to philanthropists, reach out to foundations, and try to recreate the OTA as an independent body supported by philanthropy or other means. We don't have to sit around waiting for Congress. Many of us do know philanthropies, do know funding agencies that might be willing to consider something like that. And I think it's something that we should be talking about and doing, not just talking about, it's something we should be doing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Naomi, I don't know if you have like an extra 10 minutes for questions. We're just gonna take like 3 more questions in a row.
Sure.
And
sure,
you can answer them all. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Brilliant. So, Eric, you start.
All right, thank you. I have 2 questions. First, I'm surprised you did not mention the precautionary principle as an important tool for policymakers in situations of scientific uncertainty. This is something we try to defend here in Europe. And my second question is a bit more philosophical. Don't you think that the effect of increased dominance of corporations on the production of science affects, well, the production of knowledge itself? It goes beyond, paralysis for policymakers, because in the field of molecular biology, for example, students who want to study biosafety are deterred from doing so usually because they know they will have to act as activists as much as scientists. They can be prevented from getting funded, they can be prevented from publishing, and when they manage to publish something, they are being strongly attacked by the industry. To the effect that I've heard some people like Ignacio Chapela, saying that in this field, it really goes against the whole ideal of the Enlightenment that established the basis of modern science, and that it really affects the way we view the world and the production of science itself, what we consider as true or not.
Yes, absolutely. And if I didn't say that, I apologize. I absolutely think that's true. And of course, arguments about how funding structures affect the actual specific content of science are much harder to prove and demonstrate. And actually, I've been working for 10 years on another project that got delayed because of working on Merchants of Doubt, but which is all about this issue. And I'm hoping to finish that book this year. And it's an investigation that looks extremely closely at exactly those questions in relation to Cold War science in America, focusing particularly on oceanographic research. And in that book, I have very specific examples where I show how funding structures affected both what was studied, how it was studied, and how people thought about the natural world that they were studying. So I hope you'll read that book when it comes out. Also, I can say absolutely, I think the fear of being attacked is a very strong one. Many scientists, if they see that if they work in a particular area, they'll be attacked. They just say, look, I don't want to go there. I don't want to have to deal with that. And so they'll work on other things. So it becomes a very strong negative epistemic pressure not to work on certain kinds of questions or not to work on them in certain kinds of ways. And clearly that has an effect on the knowledge production. Absolutely. I also think that it has an effect on the knowledge production in terms of people's willingness, well, in terms of how people interpret the data that they have. And again, at the risk of sounding like I'm promoting my own research too much, I published an article a few years ago with my postdoc, Kanan Bryce, and some other colleagues, in which we talked about the way in which political pressure was leading scientists to interpret, it was creating a bias in the interpretation of climate data and causing scientists to underestimate the threat of climate change. That paper, we called the phenomenon erring on the side of least drama. And we talked about it there, not so much in terms of corporate funding, but in terms of public pressure not to be perceived to be, quote, alarmist about climate change. But I think the same argument could be made about funding as well. And we certainly have evidence from the work of folks like Stan Glantz and Lisa Barrow at University of California, San Francisco, and other people who've worked on the history of tobacco, that we know that when the tobacco industry funds research, those studies are much less likely to find serious harm than studies that are not funded by the tobacco industry. And that's well documented, those funding effects. So it's absolutely clear that these things do have an impact. And again, that's why transparency, that's why revealing all data and all funding sources, and yes, having a robust public sector science as a counterweight to the potentially problematic corporate funding of science.
Thank you. Professor Millstone.
Yes, it's switched on. It is switched on now. Hello, Eric Millstone from the University of Sussex. You said, Naomi, that the accusation is made in the USA that critics of industry manufacture doubt as well as industry itself, and you said you're not aware of that. But I think perhaps that is a more prevalent phenomenon in Europe for the reason the gentleman gave earlier, where we have official commitments both at the European level and at several member states to implementing a precautionary principle. Perhaps we heard an example of this just before you spoke when José Bové was speaking, and he was talking about a moratorium on agricultural biotechnology on the grounds that there remained numerous uncertainties about impacts on public and environmental health. Now, you might well argue, we might agree even, that he wasn't manufacturing doubts, he was highlighting uncertainties. But is that a distinction without a difference?
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Eric. No, I don't think it's a distinction without a difference. And I realize, I apologize, I didn't answer the question about the precautionary principle. So the political situation, the regulatory situation is quite different in the United States than in Europe, in large part because of the role of the precautionary principle. So in Europe, you have a regulatory framework that provides justification for having a moratorium or slowdown about issues in which scientific uncertainty and at least some evidence of potential harm. In the United States, we don't have that. So it makes the situation, in my view, more difficult in the United States and easier for the corporate sector to push forward with technologies that they see as beneficial or profitable, and harder for citizens or other groups to say, wait, slow down, we have questions. Now, you are right that you could argue there's a fine line, or there's a spectrum, there's a gradation from merchandising doubt to raising legitimate uncertainties. And how you define where the line is, of course, is an important question. But certainly, again, what I started to say earlier, one of the important issues, though, is not to permit the conflation of the scientific with the social. And part of the doubt-mongering strategy also is to do exactly that, and to try to say that if someone has a concern, to undermine that concern. So it's complicated. I'm not saying this well. Let me try again. Many areas of science do have legitimate uncertainties. And certainly, as a historian of science, I'm extremely aware of the fact that in many cases there is actual debate within the scientific community. Highlighting real debate in the scientific community is a totally important, legitimate, and I would say, in fact, essential thing for us to do. So how do we identify what is, quote, legitimate uncertainty versus what's manufactured? Well, one way is to just ask simple questions about who are the experts being put forward. Because one of the things we were able to show in our research is that most of the alleged experts who were challenging climate change or who were challenging the harms of tobacco were not actually experts at all. In most cases, they weren't even scientists at all. Or if they were scientists, well, in our story, they were mostly Cold War physicists who had done no research on tobacco, no research on climate change, no research on ozone depletion. So it is important to be sensitive about who are the alleged experts who are being presented, and to be able to, that this is where expertise matters, and where scholars like ourselves have a role to play in saying, look, there's a reason that we have experts, and experts do certain kinds of things. They can't tell us what's right and wrong. They can't tell us how to run our democracy, but they can inform us about what the evidential basis is for certain kinds of claims. If you do that, then I think it also helps you to separate a concern about, let's say, whether or not GMOs are safe to eat versus whether or not they're a good idea from the perspective of political economy. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
It does. Thank you. One last question. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes. Geert Kok, Food and Water Europe. I think you already answered, because my question was around also the precautionary principle. How do you politically operationalize that? Do you have any good practices? I mean, the reason why I ask is I work on shale gas fracking, and so one of the issues that we keep coming back to is like is shale gas better than coal? Like, what is the carbon footprint of coal? And there are really no good data around that issue. And so we're sort of a catch-22 where the industry says, well, it's gas, it's better than coal, so we should just go ahead. And we say, well, there is anecdotal and some scientific evidence, which is all over the map, to say, well, there's a lot of fugitive methane, and so really shale gas is worse than coal. And so regulators sort of look at both sides of the debate and they just cannot make sense of it. So I mean, I guess this goes to the Merchants of Doubt thesis that there's two completely contradicting sets of scientific evidence. But how do you put the onus on the industry to really prove that, for example, shale gas is cleaner than coal in the absence of a complete lack of data and a complete absence of monitoring of this industry? So so my question again, like, how do you operationalize in a political environment this precautionary principle? I wonder whether you could speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question and a very important issue. So I think you actually answered your own question, because I think that part, or at least part of the answer, is monitoring. So as you said, what's shocking about this issue is that fracking has run ahead so rapidly with so little monitoring of what's been being done. So an absolute first step that should be taking place everywhere is adequate monitoring of these activities so we can actually gather more and better data. The second thing I think is, you have the precautionary principle in Europe, and the fact is there is some evidence that this is potentially problematic. I participated in a report for the Canadian government, for the Council of Canadian Academies, and I hope you'll look at it, because we actually talked about these issues in detail, and we talked about the evidential base, and we talked explicitly, and in fact, I wrote the chapter that talks about this issue of coal versus gas. And I think that the industry has put forward a lot of very poorly supported evidence claiming that gas is better. We do have evidence, including some important life cycle studies, that suggest that that claim is at least questionable. And so with the precautionary principle, you can join the precautionary principle to some of these studies that we cite to say, look, there is evidence of a problem. We don't know for sure, it's not conclusive, but it's not just anecdotal. There are real studies of life cycle analyses that make this point, and published in peer-reviewed journals by credible people. Interestingly enough, the report we wrote has not got anywhere near the attention it deserves, in part because the Council of Canadian Academies, I'm going to say this on record because this is my interpretation, how I felt that we were actually being pressured to write a very bland report, and it was not bland, that actually made some strong claims. We were encouraged to tone it down. We had a very courageous chair, John Cherry, who resisted that pressure, and we wrote a report that actually is, I think, actually quite good and quite fair and quite consistent with the evidence that we found in the literature. But when it was released by the Canadian government, it was released with a press release and a webpage that basically said that all we were doing was saying we needed more research. And we did say we needed more research, and we did say we needed monitoring, but we also said that there were substantial evidence that there were problems in relation to groundwater and in relation to methane. So I encourage you to look at that report. I think you might find it helpful. The other thing I would say about monitoring and about the evidence is the question of trajectory. So when a question is uncertain, one of the things you can ask is, well, as we do more work, how is our knowledge moving? And one of the things we know for sure about the question of fugitive methane is that recent studies have suggested that the earlier studies greatly underestimated the threat. And so that tells us that at least there's a potential problem, and that the fugitive methane releases may be higher than the industry has been claiming. And we have some very good data now from Utah and Colorado that support that argument. So I think there is data out there to support the conclusion that there are serious concerns. There are also larger scale concerns about what does it mean to commit to natural gas development in the absence of other policies to ensure transitions. We wrote about that in our report as well. So I encourage you to read that. If you have questions, I'd be happy to talk to you further about that, through email or some other means.
Thank you very much, Naomi. We're going to close the questions and answers. Not that we have extinguished our topic, far from it, but simply time is out. Thank you so much.